What is Kuyperianism, and what in the world does that have to do with pursuing feminine glory? Me and Lydia recently started reading the Stone Lectures, which is a series of lectures, I believe it's 6, that Abraham Kuyper, did on Calvinism back in 1898. Why did we think that was important, Lydia? The Stone Lectures.
If you're going to give a brief synopsis, basically, it's kind of a theological argument for what we would call today all of Christ for all of life. And so that is very pertinent to women in realizing that every moment matters, changing diapers matters, and that you have a role to play in the culture war. And so as we're thinking through these things and trying to help women kind of get in the fight, get in the game in their respective roles and in whatever ways they can and whatever capacity God has given them to get involved, we are just trying to get more women in the culture war, keep building and fighting, and that you're not just supposed to sit silently. You're not supposed to be a sweet and silent woman that just takes naps all day and is only good for birthing babies. Like, that is a wonderful part of womanhood, but there's also so much more that women can be doing. And so that was kind of our goal, is just how it has helped us in our own family. We wanted to be an aid and a help to other women, and just showing them that motherhood matters, despite what the feminists would say, but then also in other ways, that whether it's politics or you're involved in your community in certain spheres like that, women have a part to play, and that's glorious.
And so in this first interview, this will be a 2-part series. This first interview will be with Pastor Uriesou Brito, and he is going to be discussing with us what the Stone Lectures are about and kind of questions we had after reading the book, or just questions that we thought were pertinent to the culture at large and that we felt like the audience needed to hear. And so for those of you listening, Uriesou Brito will be the first part, and we were so honored to have him on, and we thoroughly enjoyed the interview, and we learned a ton in it as well. And so this will be very helpful, we believe, for you all to be listening to. In the second part, which is to be released, we will be getting into the more nitty-gritty of the Stone Lectures. So this is kind of this first interview will be kind of a broad view of getting to know who Kuyper was and what the Stone Lectures were about, and some specific questions. And then the next interview coming up will be diving into some more general questions as well, but also some very specific questions. And so we hope that you are blessed by both of these, and we hope that you go pick up the Stone Lectures. You can find that on Amazon, or you can also find it at Canon Press. And so we hope that you enjoy this, and we hope that you enjoy the episodes.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Feminine Glory Podcast. I am one of your hosts, Lydia Edmonds, and I'm joined by my delightful co-host, Esther Edmonds.
Hi, guys.
And we have a very special guest on the podcast today to talk about a very important topic. So let's jump right into it.
So today we have on the podcast Pastor Brito. He is husband to Melinda, which we had her on earlier on the podcast, and he is the father of 5 covenant children. Pastor Brito serves as a senior pastor of Providence Church, a role he has held since 2009. Pastor Brito also founded Kuyperian Commentary, an online resource for essays and podcasts, and he wrote the fantastic introduction to Canon Press edition of the Stone Lectures, which we are having him on to talk about today. We are honored to have him on the podcast today, so Pastor Brito, welcome, and thank you so much for coming on.
It's a delight to be with you, ladies. Thanks for having me.
All right, so just a bit of background for everyone for why we are talking about Kuyperianism today. So obviously our podcast is centered on feminine glory and training women to live lives that would glorify and honor God. And so for women that might be wondering, how in the world does Kuyperianism relate to me? How would you say important it is for women to grasp this idea of Kuyperianism in their everyday lives?
That's a terrific question. Well, I would want to begin by saying that if you think that theology is the kind of thing that pertains only to one sex over the other, you've already begun to sort of fail in understanding the role of theology. My old professor, John Frame, used to say that theology only becomes theology when it is applied. And so theology cannot remain in the world of the abstract. And so, therefore, if it is applied, humans are the ones who are going to embrace that particular function. And obviously that includes women and children as well. So it's important for us to grasp the reality that theology is something that is applicable. So for the ladies tuning in and wondering what in the world does Kuyper have to do with changing diapers or doing the dishes or beautifying my home? Well, the answer is everything. Because Kuyperianism at its very core produces what I call doses of ordinary faithfulness in the household and and in anywhere that a woman may be involved in. And I think if women in particular were to sort of recover this Kuyperian vision that we're going to talk about here in the podcast, I think they would also recover a level of confidence in their calling as wives or as single ladies or as merely women as participants in the life of the church. And as a result, I think that churches would worship with deeper purpose, because I think that women would embrace their roles in the church and as a result would also stop chasing roles that don't belong to them. Yeah. And so these distinctions are very important. So churches become far more refined in their purpose when women understand that their role is a distinct role that has a covenantal purpose in God's redemptive plan. So Kuyperianism, by its very definition, touches on all these things, and therefore it's very applicable for any young lady or any godly older lady in the congregation, or even the little girls that you see running around on Sunday morning.
Yes.
So I'm curious, when was your first interaction with Kuyperianism, and did you agree with it upon first coming across it?
It was a very compelling introduction to Kuyper. I was not attuned to what we call Dutch theology or the Dutch theologians. I'm from South America, Brazil, and my introduction to theology came mainly through American theologians, such as Robert Dabney, or even some of my more recent professors who are still alive, John Frame and a few others. My introduction to Kuyperianism came through, it was a sort of two-layered introduction. I encountered Kuyper fundamentally back in the late 90s as I was being introduced to theology in college. But that was at a very seed form, but it left that kind of imprint in my mind. It was sort of one of those things where I said, I'm going to put this back, and I'm going to put this back in the book, and one day I will pick it back up in chapter 7. I know exactly where it is, but I just don't have the bandwidth to deal with it now. So it was there, planted somewhere around 1999, the year 2000. And then years later, I began to reflect on the influence of Abraham Kuyper upon all my heroes, man whom I love, and I thought I should probably go to the source. And so I did. I had the opportunity to go to the source when I was in seminary studying under Professor John Frame. And my interest in Kuyper it sort of catapulted when I walked into Professor Frame's office and had the insane idea of asking to do an independent study with Professor Frame on Abraham Kuyper. Now, my proposal was merely for a 2-credit class that I would do independently with a renowned, one of the world's most well-known theologians, John Frame. And after I proposed my independent study, he doubled the amount of work I had to do. And I've never worked so hard for a couple of credits. And so I wrote for about 6 months under John Frame. And from that introduction to Abraham Kuyper, so I dealt with Abraham Kuyper's life. I dealt with his theological insights, his political pursuits. After that, it began to sort of affect everything. It grew into lectures, it grew into essays, it grew into podcasts, and to eventually founding, I think it was 2003, 2004, the Kuyperian Commentary, which, looking back, it wasn't the most brilliant idea because most folks can't even pronounce that word, which is fine. But it was, I thought I wanted to add a kind of cultural commentary, but from a perspective of someone that I admire. And I thought, well, Abraham Kuyper is that man. So Kuyper gave me the kind of vocabulary for what I already begun to suspect was there present in the Bible, but he essentially introduced the idea in a very concrete way that the lordship of Jesus didn't stop at the church door, but it extended into various areas of life as well, such as politics and culture and family, and really ultimately the whole created order.
So what's kind of, for those that may not even know, or just first getting introduced to who Kuyper was, what's kind of the overview of how we got to then things like the Stone Lectures and all of his work? How did his life kind of pan out in that way?
Okay, lovely. Let me give you sort of a synopsis of the life of Kuyper, which is probably more extensive than 10 great theologians have accomplished in a lifetime. It is so remarkable what this man accomplished that I think it would take my whole lifetime to even consume all his works. But Abraham Kuyper was a Dutch theologian, and he was born in the Netherlands, but he was not just a theologian, he was also a pastor, he was a statesman, he was a public intellectual, and he grew up in a Dutch Reformed home. And if you ladies are familiar with the Heidelberg Catechism, it's a familiar Dutch catechism that he grew up reciting and memorizing. And as he grew, he began to sort of extend his influence in various fields, not only the church, but also in the state, and also delving into even some very interesting theological conversations regarding the role of baptism and regeneration, some interesting dynamics as well. But what Kuyper did when he was introduced to concepts like modernism is that he kind of rebelled against his upbringing early on in his theological studies. And as he began to pursue further academic studies, he realized that he didn't have the resources he needed to pursue further academic studies, which led him, this is a longer story, but it led him to a little country church in the Netherlands. And that country church, filled with what we call here in the South rednecks, that country church of Dutch farmers, essentially with very little, let's say with very little intellectual elite baggage, let's put it that way to say the least, that country church essentially transformed the life of this intellectual elite, Abraham Kuyper. And there's many great stories about this, but there were cases where Kuyper in his sermons was not proclaiming what they considered to be Reformed orthodoxy. And when Kuyper wanted to do pastoral visits in people's homes, there were many in his congregation who wouldn't even allow their own pastor inside because they felt that he was betraying the legacy of the Reformation. And so it's really a great story, but it was there where Kuyper undergoes this kind of reconversion in many ways, and his renewal in his Christian faith. So he was this Renaissance man who did everything. And when he began to realize that there was this interconnectedness of life with everything, with farming, with writing, with teaching, with raising children, he recovered in many ways a sort of robust, thorough Christian way of seeing the world. He was not content for Christians to remain in this kind of private religious experience, which was very common in many of the pietistic Dutch environment. But he argued that Christ claims every square inch of life, and therefore Christians must think and they must live as Christians, not only at home, but in worship, in their education, their politics, and their art, and their families, and their labors. And so Kuyper offered a comprehensive approach that left no room for neutrality. And you ladies may be familiar with his famous quote that I have on a beautiful portrait in my home, where he says, "There's not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, mine." And I think that is the kind of theology that encapsulates the life of Abraham Kuyper.
That is very, very good. So one of the things in the Stone Lectures that Kuyper is discussing is Calvinism. And so for those who may not know, how does Calvinism, first of all, what is it? And then how does it tie into Kuyper and Kuyper's life?
Okay, that is a really interesting question. And as I'm thinking about that question, let me approach it this way. So Calvinism, when it is interpreted by sort of your modern evangelical, sort of here in the South, the culture I'm most familiar with, it's usually synonymous with what some call the 5 points of Calvinism, or the acronym TULIP, and we know how that goes. Well, Kuyper would convulse over that definition. He would be very opposed to limiting the doctrine of Calvinism to merely a doctrine of salvation. But for Kuyper, it was a God-centered vision of reality. That's what Calvinism was. And what it taught was that man needed divine guidance, and they needed to live in the presence of God all their days. And that matters because for Kuyper, Christianity is not just a hobby, or it's not just an experience you have on Sundays. It was a way of, inhabiting the world before the face of God. So it is important because Calvinism for Kuyper meant that you begin your thought process, you begin interpreting reality, and the beginning point is God, and the middle point is God, and the end point is God. and every piece of life is under God's authority. I suppose I should add one more footnote here for many of the folks who are listening here. I would say for Kuyper, he made a distinction, and this is sort of not well known, but I think it's important to keep in mind, between Reformed and Calvinism. So for Kuyper, Reformed simply meant the doctrine of the church per se. And we call that in Book 4 of Calvin's Institutes, he focuses on the doctrine of the church. What happens in worship and the sacraments and preaching. That was Reformed. When you open the doors of the church and apply the doctrine of the church to the world, he referred to that as Calvinism. So some people could be Reformed but not a Calvinist. And some people could be Calvinistic but not Reformed. Some people could have a great desire to apply the Bible but not be a part of the life of the church. So that's an interesting distinction that people don't typically keep in mind today, but I have found to be very, very helpful. You want to be a Calvinist? Then it's much more than simply spouting out an acronym from a little flower. It is the comprehensive nature of life under Jesus Christ. That's what Calvinism is, the divine guidance of God in the lives of his people.
So why do you think, to me it makes perfect sense. It's probably as part of the, we were raised Calvinistic, theology applied, all of that. And so, but it seems to me that it's not, obviously not the case everywhere, but based off of scripture, and then also it's just kind of like you're saying, Kuyper kind of gave a vocabulary to what we see in scripture as well. Why it's not, it just seems to make perfect sense that we would apply scripture in that way to every sphere of life. So why don't we see more of that?
More of the application process?
Yes.
I think in our world, in the Calvinistic world, and I grew up as a Baptist boy, so I came to Calvinism later in a past millennia in the late 90s. But I think there's a common misconception that Calvinism is simply a doctrine of predestination. And if it's just a doctrine of predestination, let's say, then it can produce a kind of abstract theology. Or the other extreme would be, the other ditch would be that it can produce a doctrine of extreme pietism, which is very internalized. So think of it very abstract, high in the sky, armchair theologian, up in the towers, or very private, down in my heart. Where? Down in my heart, that kind of thing. But if you read Abraham Kuyper, what you're going to see is that Calvinism is a life system. It's a call, let's say, Calvinism is a call to activism. It's a summons to cultural engagement. And that means that for ladies and for men, you cannot remain passive. It's a call to a bold living under God's rule. And so many people who have sort of thought through the doctrine of Calvinism are very content in keeping it in the arena of predestination and God's eternal decretal plans. And sometimes that philosophy can lead to a kind of fatalism or even a kind of, let's say, cultural retreat, and that's a danger. So the misconceptions, I think, have led to a lack of application in the life of many Calvinists and certainly in the broader evangelical world.
Speaking of the life systems, Kuyper contrasts in his book on the Stone Lectures that he contrasts the Calvinist life system and the modernist life system, and he says that those two are, quote, wrestling together in mortal combat. So could you give a 30,000-foot view of what modernism is, and then why Kuyper would have been so against it?
That's a terrific question. I think I dealt with a little bit in my introduction to the Stone Lectures. And by the way, the Stone Lectures were lectures delivered at Princeton Seminary in 1898, where the great theologian, one of the greatest theologians at Princeton, Benjamin Warfield, known as B.B. Warfield, invited Abraham Kuyper to deliver some lectures. And so that's what the Stone Lectures are. And so when you talk about a 30-foot view, at a high level, modernism is essentially men's attempt in Genesis to build Babel. Modernism is men's attempt to build a world from, let's say, from the resources of autonomous man rather than the resources of God's revelation. So in my analysis of Kuyper over the years, I've noted that he's got his own definitions, and it's something like that modernism seeks to build a world from, I think he uses the language of the data of natural man. He wants to construct man after his own image. And Kuyper thought that was a denial of God's revelation. And you remember that great scene in Genesis when God, which is a statement of mockery that a lot of readers overlook, when God says, "Let us go down to see what they're up to." That is a statement of utter mockery, right? He's saying they're so minute and minuscule that we have to go all the way down to see how high Babel is. That's modernism in a heartbeat. And Kuyper opposes it because he says that the Christian faith, if it can't deny revelation. If we deny revelation, we weaken the Christian inheritance, and we train men to think that they are the starting point of everything. And for Kuyperianism, and you see this also in another Dutch theologian named Cornelius Van Til in the 20th century, for Kuyperianism, man is not the starting point. God is the starting point. So the battle is not merely political. The battle is not aesthetic. The modernism debate is a battle over whether God speaks with authority over our lives or not. And modernism says no. Kuyperianism says absolutely.
So I believe it was around the time that the Stone Lectures, the one with the edition with your introduction, it was coming out, that you were on a Canon Calls episode with Jake McAtee. And
yes, I remember.
He, which was very helpful, by the way, so everyone should go listen to it. But it was, I remember he brought up that you have kind of this layer of, like, you have people like Kuyper and then Chesterton and Lewis and Francis Schaeffer, and all of them kind of dealt with this idea of modernism, modern man. And so you've touched on this a little bit, but if there's anything to add to it, how is it, like, you have all of these faithful people that would kind of bring a rally cry to fight against modernism, and then also God has given us his word, and yet still you see things like modernism take root in the culture. So how does that kind of, what went wrong, I guess, that you have all those people and then also most importantly God's word, and yet we still kind of fell for it?
I see. Oh, great question. Well, I think what you have in the men that you mentioned they're intellectual rebels, right? Chesterton's intellectual rebel, Kuyper in many ways. They're men who defied modernism when modernism was cool and hip. And they defied it. And I think the reason we still have the root of these things in our culture is because rebellion is perennial. The human heart is always tempted towards autonomy. And that's, thanks be to God, well, we have confession of sins available for us on the Lord's Day and throughout the week. God has given us his word very plainly, but man is very prone to wonder, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love. Man prefers self-rule, and modernism is simply one refined expression of that old temptation. Augustine once said that the first sin that overtook man will be the last sin that he will overcome, and that was in reference to pride. And so this battle, I think, modernism is not just an ancient doctrine, it's a battle that keeps returning, but it returns in different clothing, you know? Mm-hmm. And the issue is not merely intellectual, it's a covenantal issue. And because it's covenantal, it comes back dressed in different garbs. And men want a world in which they don't have to kneel. And so the church, what we need to do is we need to keep preaching, teaching, worshiping, doing good podcasts, and building in a way that reminds the world that there's no neutrality. And the reality is that I think these kinds of individuals, men, women, and children, are going to be at times sitting next to us in the pew or in the chairs. They're going to be tempted to self-rule. They're going to be tempted to be the master of their faith, the captain of their soul. They're going to be tempted to provide a kind of control that is man-centered rather than submission to the control that God has. And so it's a rebellion problem, and I think it'll continue. It's just at times more sophisticated, more subtle in our day.
So why is it so important, do you think, for Christians to grasp one of the essential fundamental thoughts of Calvinism and then Kuyperianism, that every moment and every aspect of the Christian's life is to be lived coram Deo in the presence of God? And then along with that, how can we continually remind ourselves of that fact?
Okay, very good. Well, because once a Christian learns to live coram deo, a phrase that I learned when I was with R.C. Sproul in Orlando, he used that language quite often. Once a Christian lives coram deo, he let me phrase this way, he stops compartmentalizing life. He stops dividing life into little compartments. He's not asking whether God cares about his decision, this purchase, this habit, this meal, this vote, this friendship, this school, or this vocation. He knows that every choice is made before the face of God. And God cares about everything. And this is precisely the point I think that's so pertinent to this conversation here, is that there's no room for neutrality, and that our identities as men, as husbands, as wives, as women, as churchmen, churchwomen, our identities are stabilized when we remember that we stand in the presence of God. When we don't remember that we stand, when we're living coram deo, the reality is that once church is over, and church, the gathering of God's people on the Lord's Day is the most significant day of the week. But if we're not there in the heavenly places, communing with Jesus Christ, if what we do from there is merely remain content with that, let's call it a spiritual high, and we don't want to heavenize earth, the language of one of my Sunday school teacher here, James Jordan, who worked with me for many years. If we don't want to heavenize earth, that means if we are in the heavenly places on Sunday and we don't want to bring heaven into our earthly activities, what we are doing is we're failing to understand this concept. We're not living in the presence of God. We're living in the present. We're acting as if God is absent, and that's a great philosophical question to deal with on the absence of God. But the reality is God is always present, even when we don't feel that he is present. The psalmist struggled with this quite a bit, but I think that's the reality we need to embrace. Otherwise, we're going to fragment our lives, and we will at times convince ourselves or even justify ourselves in doing things as if God were absent.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things I know Kuyper talked about in I believe it was lecture 2, is Calvinism and religion. And he was talking about how religion is for the sake of God and not for the sake of man. So could you kind of explain what Kuyper meant when he talked about that?
The religion is for the sake of God and not for the sake of man. Well, if I know my Kuyperianism well, I think what he meant was that worship, faith, and obedience are not ultimately instrument for making our lives easier. It's first for the glory of God. He was a good Calvinist, right? We don't begin with men's felt needs and then attach God as a useful supplement, let's put it that way. We begin with God himself. He's the beginning, he's the middle, he's the end, he's the Alpha and the Omega. And once religion becomes man-centered, it will only last so long as it remains useful. And that is a kind of concept that can be very easily disposed. I mean, you may have examples of this in your own lives, ladies, of people who grew up with you, who went to school with you, and now no longer live in the presence of God. I have that example. I have example of men who sat next to me in a Master's of Divinity class in seminary, and who were giving the right answer to world-renowned professors, and only 2 years later, they abandoned their wives and now abandon their God. And so once religion is oriented to the glory of God, then obedience can endure these things. They can endure suffering. They can endure loss, or they can endure that sense of the absence of God. It's a theocentric instinct that runs through Kuyper's treatment of Calvinism. And when he criticizes privatized Christianity, he's criticizing the kind of person that views religion as only useful if it suits his purposes. When it no longer suits his purposes, then he just sets it aside. And that religion was for the sake of God. For Kuyper, that meant that it's not just something that intended to make our life easier. It's intended to make our lives richer in the presence of God.
For those that might hear that and then become nervous that that could be them if they don't continually live and remind themselves of living Coram Deo. What would be some ways that they could continually keep that mindset before them of what religion is for and stay grounded in that so they do not stray off on that path?
Oh, that's a great pastoral question, and you're talking to a pastor, so I can elaborate a little bit on that. I do think there are some great prayers that I've used over the years, and I think in my book on the War of the Priesthood, I attach a few of those. The prayer of St. Francis, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace, or even the biblical phraseology of bringing every thought captive into obedience of Jesus Christ. These are the kinds of things that ought to be repeated, not in a kind of false or overly repetitive mantra, but it ought to be said in times of doubt. And so this is the kind of thing that I think Christianity, at least in our environment, suffers a little bit from, is that we don't tend to look at the concept of ritual as this rich, embodied living. And if we did, then there will be a lot of repetitive things in our own lives that we would use as a way of helping us in our seasons of doubt or even in our seasons of where we lack comprehension. And I think that that's a fair diagnosis in the sense that people do struggle through doubts, and I think we just finished preaching through the first 10 Psalms. The Psalms are all about that. There is a kind of holy complaining that should be exercised by the Christian. But when the psalmist begins in this kind of holy complaint, he always ends with, "But I trust in you, O Lord." And what I've told my congregation over the last 18 years is that you can do all the complaining to God you want, as long as when that's over, the next thing you do is praise God from whom all blessings flow. So you can complain, but if it doesn't lead to doxology, your complaint will destroy you as a human being. You'll become bitter. You'll become, your gossiping will become a mode of operation for you. Angry, you'll become tedious as a human being. Your storytelling abilities diminish. It's an incredible sort of psychological dimension as well. And so what I would say to people like that is read the Psalms, sing the Psalms, abide in the Psalms, but then grab certain prayers that are rich for you so that you are reminded. And for ladies who live in communities together, never privatize your doubts for too long. There are personal things that need to be kept privately. I understand that, but there are seasons when it is very important for a woman to call another woman and say, "Look, can you pray over me? Can you put a blessing over me at this stage? Can you read a psalm for me?" And that communal perspective in seasons of doubt is not just meaningful, but it's necessary. I'll make this statement here. Our congregation is very large. We have over 500 on Easter Sunday. God is really blessing us. And when people sometimes come to my office, they ask, they're naturally nervous, and especially if they've seen my material online, they just feel nervous to be around me. And I encourage them by saying that virtually every family in this congregation has seen me for some woe or another, for some difficulty, for some counseling session or another. And so we have to remember our frame, remember our weakness before we're able to ask for help. If we think we are strong in and of ourselves, that is going to lead to a kind of a series of little deaths that they're consequential and cumulative, and in the long term, you won't recognize the person you once were.
Wow. It's very good.
So, in lecture 3 of the Stone Lectures, Kuyper was talking about this idea of sphere sovereignty.
Right.
And so, could you kind of just talk about what are those 3 spheres, and then why is understanding them so important for us to grasp?
All right, the famous 3 spheres of Abraham Kuyper, the recurring triad in his writings, which are essentially very easy. It's family, church, and state. So just keep these 3 in mind: family, church, and state. And his main point was that each of these spheres has its own given jurisdiction. And that means that none of them can uprightly absorb another into their own sphere. So the church can't say, I'm going to absorb the state into my own sphere, or the pastor can't say, I'm now in charge of your home to a husband or a father. So you can't lawfully absorb these things. Obviously, it's happened, and we call that unlawful and sinful when it happens. And of course, this matters because tyranny, not just at the home, not just at the state, not just at the church, tyranny happens when one sphere refuses to accept its limits. That's what happens. When the state wants to manage what belongs to the household, that's a form of tyranny. When the church is tempted to dictate what belongs to the civil sphere, that's another danger as well. When families neglect their own duties and they begin to invite outside control, that's a form of tyranny as well. When fathers want to destroy congregations, that's a form of tyranny as well. So sphere sovereignty is simply a way of saying that God has ordered human life, and freedom depends on honoring that order. And so it's very important to keep these three things in mind. Now, are there times when these spheres relate to one another? Absolutely. The magisterial reformers talked about the importance of church and state relations. That's a conversation I'm happy to touch on as well. But these spheres, they converse with one another. They ought to be in harmony with one another. They ought to have the same telos. That's important. But they cannot absorb one into the other. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
So why don't you think that pastors embrace the three spheres of sovereignty and proclaim it from their pulpits? Where did we lose that ground?
Oh, great question. Well, I think because a lot of pastors were taught to, or maybe trained to think of the Christian faith in very privatized terms. And what you see is that when faith is reduced only to personal experience or personal salvation or inward piety, then pastors are very content to sort of settle in this pietistic preaching. Let's deal with your sins, but let's not deal with the sins of society or the sins of the church. And pastors are going to hesitate to speak authoritatively on the ordering of family, the ordering of culture, the ordering of law, and the ordering of civil life. Now, some people, and we have seen a lot of examples of this, ladies, in modern Reformed theology, some people are very fearful. Some ministers are very fearful of even being labeled political. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that was very unique about the life of Abraham Kuyper is that he helped pastors sort of recover courage in realizing that the Bible is by nature a political book. I mean, think about it. We've just gone through 40 days of Lent, and we've just celebrated Easter Sunday, and Easter goes for 50 days, which is wonderful just to say out loud. And it's a long and a great opportunity to pop up lots of champagne bottles. But if you think about this situation, think about the death, the resurrection, and then we're going to celebrate the ascension of Jesus in a few weeks. All of these events were public events. Death, burial, resurrection. In the book of 1 Corinthians, Paul says there were 500 witnesses to the resurrection. That's a pretty significant number. And so these were public events in the life of our blessed Lord. And therefore, that means that if the life of Jesus from his earthly ministry to his ascension were public events, then those who follow in his train ought to have public lives. Mm-hmm. And so to preach Christ as Lord means preaching his authority over all the spheres he made. And how many spheres that he made? All spheres. And that's a good little catechism for our children.
So how different would you say than 2020 with COVID-19 and all that would have looked if we had a proper understanding of the three spheres?
Very different. There would have been obviously a wild response from churches, and I actually think that the state would have acted far quicker to end their lunacy if they saw, because evangelicals rule this country. We are far the majority here. And I think a lot of this, of course, there's a tie-in to another theology called the radical two-kingdom assumption, which is essentially that the church has nothing to say to the political sphere. Now, that's very sophisticated at one level, but at a very practical level, it just means that people think that only the internal piety matters. And these are external things. We're not going to talk about these things here. But a stronger doctrine, I think, of sphere sovereignty would have reminded families that the household is not a branch office of the state. And it would have reminded churches that the magistrate does not own the keys of the kingdom. The Bible says in the book of Matthew that the ministers of the gospel holds the keys of the kingdom. They're the ones who excommunicate. They're the ones who establish the authority of the church. And so when the man wearing fancy three-piece suits show up at the church door, you can come up with several responses, but you can say something like, "Not in my house." And so pastors, they could have, and many of them did, could have equipped men to govern their own homes with confidence. They could have helped their congregations to resist the kind of unnecessary state encroachments, but a lot of them didn't. And the reason they didn't was because it was a lot more, it was comfortable. Mm-hmm. And so things would have been very different. I think the dynamic of society would have changed rapidly. Now, obviously, I live here in Florida, so my life was very much at peace. In many ways, we call our governor here Saint DeSantis, and he was an angelic messenger of God, and we're grateful for him. But what's really remarkable of that is that even in Pensacola, which is one of the largest concentration of churches in the world, even here, to my knowledge, to my distinct knowledge, and I'm fairly aware of my own town, our congregation, our CREC congregation, was the only congregation that remained open from the first Sunday of 2020 till when the lunacy ended sometime in 2023. Even in a state where you have remarkable liberty, the vast majority of church, I say 99.9% of churches, I'm sure there might have been one or two here that I'm not aware of, decided to close down. And so it's not just about what the state allows you to do, it's about what you think God allows you to do. And the one thing God allows you to do as a church is to, under ordinary circumstances and under extraordinary circumstances, what God calls us to do is to worship him when we gather as a people. And that certainly did not happen.
Mm. So how do you think if pastors had been preaching this three-sphere sovereignty and the men started leading their homes in that way, how do you think directly that would have affected then what the women did in their homes, the wives and the moms?
Well, it surely would have granted them a lot of boldness in their endeavors. It would have granted them boldness, and women need to see that men lead. And this is a very profound statement. It may not sound profound at first, but I think as you meditate on it, it has matured a lot more in my life over the last 20 years, is that every institution looks like their leader. And that means that under all sorts of ordinary circumstances, the household is going to look like the father of the home under ordinary circumstances. And if the father is not leading the way, coming boldly before the throne of grace, then the wife will follow suit. A man cannot complain about his wife if he cannot complain about her labors in the home if he's not the one setting an example of godliness and love and compassion and tenderness and protection. When the Bible says that a man who does not provide for his family is worse than an infidel, this is not just financial provision. It's more than that. It's physical protection, it's affection, it's care, but it's also providing the environment whereby a woman can flourish in her home, whereby a woman can beautify her home, and providing the tools whereby she can do these things, where she can bring order and decency to her home, where she can homeschool her kids orderly. That is also under the prerogative, under the jurisdiction of a husband in the home. And so there ought to be mutual encouragement, yes. Now, there are lots of problems I think I've seen over the years with wives who want to rule the home. But again, I think that's also a fundamental problem of the man who's allowed that to take place. So circling back to your question here, I think a man who established an environment of peace, of shalom, will necessarily provide an environment where his wife will be able to flourish under that shalom.
Very good. Circling back kind of to the political talk in the three spheres of sovereignty, do you think Kuyper would have been in favor of Christian nationalism?
Well, great question. I can see you ladies are trying to get me in trouble. Let me answer that question somewhat carefully here,
Okay.
and because I have a sort of a public face, let me answer it fairly directly here. I think Kuyper would have rejected, and I've thought about this at some level because obviously these conversations are all they're happening within my own denomination, they're happening in the broader Reformed community, they're happening on X. I think Kuyper would have rejected a nakedly secular state. I know that for a fact because he believed that civil life must answer to God. At the same time, my own response, and again, this is my inner circle. The Christian nationalist advocates are some of my closest friends. We do work together in Washington, D.C. I think that the label Christian nationalism, I think, carries too many conflicting meanings to be useful. That's my own perspective. It carries too many conflicting meanings to be useful. And could I use it? Maybe in certain environments, but I would certainly ask, please define that for me, because it can mean something else. In certain circles, it can mean a Protestant Hitler or a Protestant Franco. In other circles, it can simply mean the authority of God over a nation. That's the definition I would have. I've written about this quite a bit. I don't identify with the label, even though I agree with much of the underlying impulse. I think that government should promote true religion. That government should honor Christianity above other faiths, which is why I'm so thrilled with Secretary Pete Hegseth. So I think the better Kuyperian answer would be something like, Christ must rule nations. And I would probably put a period there, but as a footnote, I would say something like, and I think modern labels, I think they often obscure as much as they reveal. And so if I say Christ must rule over nations, that is a clearer picture than if I were to say I'm a Christian nationalist. Yeah. There was an interview some months ago, and I remember the extent of it, but I remember hearing a liberal essentially calling anyone who believed in God a Christian nationalist. And I thought, wow, that couldn't get any broader. But I think that's one of the difficulties with these kinds of definitions. Again, I don't identify with it, but I have a lot of underlying agreements with the concept. And I think Kuyper would have had that perspective as well.
Yes. So what would you say is the distinction between putting Christian leaders in political office and then holding them to a biblical standard versus this idea of a Christian prince, which Kuyper definitely seems to disagree with, or a Protestant Hitler, like you were referring to? Right.
So I think the distinction is between what we call it personal piety in office and an over-concentrated political theology. A Christian office holder, according to Romans 13, is a deacon of righteousness. He should absolutely judge and be judged by biblical standards. But Kuyper's concern was to avoid, let's say, collapsing all social life into the state. I think that's the best way to phrase it. Or let me phrase this way as well. Imagining that one sanctified ruler can carry the entire moral burden of a people. I hope that's helpful. So the magistrate does have a very real task under God. But again, this is a confusion of spheres. But he's not the church. He's not the father of every household. He's not the redeemer of culture. And that's why I think sphere of sovereignty matters so much than we give it credit for. So even though I do a lot of work in D.C. and I'm grateful for the opportunities God has opened up for me, I'm really, truly thankful to God. I never imagined being in positions of, speaking with incredible political figures who are very godly, by the way. Even though I treasure this kind of national politicking, my ultimate concern is much more at a local level. I think we can be so DC minded that we're no locally good, and that's a problem. We need to realize that the things that will affect us the most, or go back to the question you had about COVID. At that point, during that season, it was very imperative that ministers had a way of thinking through these issues here, because I am the one who would know my parishioners' lives far better than some dignitary or governmental official who has never met them before. God has placed them under my care. And so that local concern is your local church, your local community is a far more significant element than the kind of national politics that we burden ourselves so much with. And the local magistrates have unique tasks to their people, and the national magistrates have another task to a broader community. But at the end of the day, I would put far more emphasis on the local magistrates who understand the concerns of the people under their care.
So, as a pastor, could you kind of cast a vision, let's say, for what culture would look like if Christian men and women in churches all across the nation, and then as well as the world, how would culture look if we all kind of adopted this idea of every moment is Coram Deo, and this idea of like all of Christ for all of life, so to speak?
Right. Well, I think every city would have their own mood. There's Moscow mood, there's Pensacola mood, and I think there's something to that as well. Christians would work, they would build, they would vote, they would teach. I think I said this earlier, but they would make art. I'm reading this lovely book called Theo of Golden, and it's just so lovely about the beauty of art and in a story fashion, and how he uses art to bring benedictions to other people. It's the book I'm reading right now, just a lovely novel. But I think Christians would make art. I think they would raise children in the context of goodness, truth, and beauty. I think the ordinary saint would charge the gates of hell, not with some kind of fanciful or sophisticated categories or in extraordinary mission trips to Haiti. But I think the ordinary saint, the ordinary mom would charge the gates of hell with ordinary life, with ordinary family, ordinary church. And that's how cultures have changed over time. You know, I was doing a lecture in somewhere here in Florida, I can't remember, many years ago, and our children were little at the time, littler, and my wife was changing one of our kids' diapers, and a very, very renowned theologian who has just got a wonderful reputation, he passed by and saw that my wife was changing a baby, and he said, "Don't you forget, young lady, that is kingdom work." And I thought, what a noble thing to say. And that was very meaningful for my wife. And I think that's the kind of reality that I think Kuyperianism brings. It's a kind of a flesh and blood. It's an embodied living. And I think if that were to be applied, I think men and women would function very differently in our society.
Yes.
Amen. So kind of stemming off of this and going back to what we were talking about, a lot of things that Christians refer to is this over here, this is secular, kind of keeping the sacred versus secular divided. Do you think that there is such a thing as a sacred secular divide?
Well, I think there's a distinction between callings, that's for sure, but there's not a divide in terms of the authority of Jesus, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. The sacred versus secular split, I think it becomes dangerous when it suggests that one portion of your life belongs to God and others are sort of morally neutral somewhere here in this sphere. Mm-hmm. I push very firmly against that. I think all spheres must conform to the rule of Jesus Christ. Christ is not Lord over the sermon and then absent from the city council, or he's not Lord over the sacraments and then absent from the kitchen or from the classroom or from the ledger book. He is present over all things. And so I understand the distinction in a more formal setting, but at a practical setting, that distinction cannot exist. All things are sacred. I was talking to one of my boys when I was teaching him to tie his shoes some years ago. And I said, "Remember, buddy, what you're doing, that God cares about what you're doing." He goes, "Really?" I said, he cares about how you tie your shoes because he cares about your safety. And if you tie your shoes poorly, you will trip over it at some time or another, and you might damage your body. And it's very important that order and decency are not just the kinds of things that are reserved for specific high intellectual events or formalized events, but that order and decency are applied to everything. And that's where I think we could say, in some way, everything is truly sacred.
Amen.
Well, Pastor Brito, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes.
This has been a very encouraging and helpful talk, and I trust it'll be the same for others as well. So thank you so much.
Yes.
My absolute pleasure to be with you all. Thank you for having me.
Until next time, ladies, keep pursuing feminine glory, and we'll see you on the next episode of the Feminine Glory Podcast. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Well, everyone, this is the favorite part, everyone's favorite part of the podcast, where we ask you to like and subscribe our videos because YouTube likes us to. So we're doing it. And
Yeah.
Apple Podcasts likes us too. Wherever you find our channel, they like us to ask you to like and subscribe. So we're doing it.
So if you are in favor, go ahead and smash that subscribe button. Or, you don't have to.
You can just walk away.
And we won't be offended.
Nope. If you don't like us, just walk away. Don't feel like you need to say anything. Don't feel like you need to explain yourself. Let's just do a clean breakup. You go walk away. And you don't ever have to listen to us again. So there you go.
So if you feel so obliged,
Yep.
you can like it, you can subscribe, or you can go on your merry way.
Yep. Either way, the choice is up to you. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood.
Will you take the one less traveled by?
Will it make all the difference? Whether you listen to us or not. Anyway, there you go. There's our little bit that we had to say. To subscribe.
All right.
So thank you guys.
Bye.
Bye.